After 3 years away, a Marine comes home. What his German Shepherd does is unbelievable. Under Virginia's golden sunset, Marine Sergeant Ryan Carter stepped off the bus, the weight of 3 years away settling deep in his chest. His duffel bag slung over his shoulder, he inhaled the scent of damp earth and autumn leaves, a stark contrast to the dust and heat he had left behind. The streets of Oak Ridge were quieter than he remembered. The homes unchanged, yet carrying a sense of time passed without him. As he turned onto Maple Street, his steps slowed. His childhood home stood at the end of the cul-de-sac, a familiar warmth radiating from its white-paneled exterior. The porch light already flickering on as dusk settled. But it wasn't just the house that made his heart race. It was the thought of the dog he had left behind. Rex had been just a puppy when Ryan last saw him, an energetic 8-month-old German Shepherd with oversized paws and boundless energy. He had promised he would return, but 3 years was a lifetime for a dog. Would Rex even remember him? Ryan clenched his fist around the strap of his bag, pushing aside the creeping doubt. As he reached the driveway, he took a deep breath and whispered, "Rex?" The silence was heavy, the only sound the rustling of wind through the trees. Then from somewhere beyond the house, a deep bark shattered the stillness. A shadow moved near the porch, muscles rippling beneath a sleek black and tan coat. Rex stood at the top of the steps, ears erect, eyes sharp. He was no longer a clumsy pup. He was a full-grown protector, every inch of him radiating power and vigilance. Ryan barely had time to brace himself before Rex launched forward, paws thudding against the pavement as he closed the distance. A growl rumbled in his throat, a warning, a question. But as Ryan dropped his bag and opened his arms, Rex's growl melted into something else entirely, a joyous, high-pitched whine. The massive dog crashed into Ryan with unrestrained force, knocking him off balance and sending them both tumbling onto the grass. Warm, rough tongue licked at his face in frantic desperation, tail thudding wildly against the ground. Laughter bubbled from Ryan's chest as he wrapped his arms around Rex's thick neck, feeling the familiar heartbeat beneath his fingers. "I missed you too, buddy," he murmured, his voice thick with emotion. From the porch, a sharp gasp broke through the moment. "Ryan?" Linda Carter, his mother, stood at the door, hand over her mouth, eyes glistening. Beside her, his younger sister Mia, now a teenager, let out a surprised laugh. "He remembers you," she exclaimed, rushing forward just as Ryan managed to sit up, Rex still circling him in excited bursts. Linda reached him first, pulling him into a tight embrace, the scent of home, lavender and fresh-baked bread, wrapping around him. "You're really here," she whispered against his shoulder. "I'm home, Mom," Ryan replied, holding on to her just as tightly. Inside, the house was almost exactly as he had left it. Pictures still lined the walls, familiar furniture stood in place, and the faint hum of the old refrigerator filled the space. Yet there was something different, a presence that hadn't been there before. Rex followed at his heels, pressing against his leg as if afraid he might disappear again. As they settled into the kitchen, Mia plopped into her chair, grinning. "Rex never forgot you. You should have seen him, Ryan. Every day he'd sit by the mailbox, waiting for your letters." Linda nodded, her eyes warm. "He carried your Marine cap around too. Wouldn't let anyone touch it." As if on cue, Rex trotted off and returned moments later, a worn-out cap clenched gently in his jaws. He dropped it at Ryan's feet, eyes expectant. Ryan swallowed hard, picking up the familiar piece of fabric. "You kept this for me, huh?" he murmured, rubbing Rex's ears. That night over dinner, Linda mentioned something that made Ryan pause. "Lately, Rex has been acting strange," she said, stirring her tea absent-mindedly. "Almost like he knew you were coming back." Ryan glanced at the dog, now lying at his feet, eyes half-lidded, but ears twitching at every sound. "How so?" "More alert than usual, restless, watching the yard a lot, especially near the shed." Ryan frowned. Rex had always been smart, but this was different. Later, as Ryan sat on the back porch, enjoying the crisp night air, Rex nudged his hand and trotted toward the yard, pausing to look back. "You want to show me something?" Ryan followed, the cool grass damp beneath his boots. Rex led him to a far corner near the tool shed, sniffing the ground with focused intent before digging. Dirt flew as Ryan knelt beside him, his heart pounding. After a few moments, something hard and metallic emerged from the soil. Ryan reached in, pulling out a small, rusted tin box. Inside, beneath layers of dirt, were a military badge and a bundle of sealed documents. A sharp gust of wind rustled the trees as Ryan turned the papers over, his father's name stamped on the front. Project Sentinel. He barely had time to process the words before a low growl rumbled from Rex's chest. Ryan's gaze snapped up. The hair along Rex's spine bristled, his golden eyes locked onto the shadows beyond the fence. A figure lingered near the edge of the property, barely visible in the darkness. Ryan's muscles tensed, instincts sharpening. Someone was watching. The night air grew colder as Ryan tightened his grip on the tin box, his pulse steady, but his mind racing. Rex stood rigid beside him, his growl low and unwavering, his body coiled like a spring ready to strike. The shadow near the fence didn't move, but Ryan could feel the weight of its gaze, the silent calculation of someone who wasn't expecting to be noticed. Years of military training kicked in. Ryan didn't react, didn't charge forward. Instead, he slowly reached down, brushing his fingers against Rex's fur, a silent signal to stay alert. The figure hesitated, then turned sharply, disappearing into the darkness beyond the trees. Ryan remained motionless, listening for footsteps, the crunch of leaves, any sound that would betray their direction. But there was nothing. Only the wind through the branches and the distant hum of a passing car. Rex let out a final snarl before lowering his head, sniffing the ground where the intruder had stood. Ryan exhaled slowly, forcing his heartbeat to steady, then turned his attention back to the box in his hands. Project Sentinel. He didn't know what it meant, but the weight of his father's name on the document sent a chill through him. His father had never spoken much about his work in the military, always keeping details vague, brushing off questions with a distracted smile. But Ryan remembered the tension in his father's shoulders, the way his gaze would drift into the distance, as if haunted by something unseen. And now, 3 years after his death, his secrets were buried in their own backyard. Pocketing the documents, Ryan gave Rex a firm pat. "Come on, buddy, let's take this inside." As they stepped back into the warm glow of the kitchen, Linda glanced up from where she sat at the table, her brow furrowing at Ryan's tense expression. "What is it?" she asked, setting down her tea. Ryan hesitated. He wanted answers, but he didn't want to alarm her. Not yet. Instead, he forced a small smile. "Nothing, just Rex chasing off a raccoon." The lie felt strange on his tongue, but Linda seemed satisfied, shaking her head with a chuckle. "That dog's always on high alert." Mia, however, narrowed her eyes, her gaze flicking between Ryan and Rex. She had always been sharp, too observant for her own good, but she didn't press the issue. Later, in the quiet of his old bedroom, Ryan spread the documents across his desk, scanning the pages under the dim yellow light of his lamp. The words were heavily redacted, black lines striking through sentences, but the ones that remained sent a shiver down his spine. K9 cognitive enhancement trials, neurological conditioning, unregulated field testing, subject retention. Ryan's breath caught. This wasn't just a military dog training program. This was something else entirely. And beneath one of the reports in faded ink was a handwritten note. "Carter, this goes deeper than we thought. If something happens to me, make sure he's safe. He's the key." There was no signature, but Ryan recognized the handwriting. His father's. A knock at the door made him snap the file shut. "Yeah?" The door creaked open and Mia peeked in, arms crossed. "You're a terrible liar," she said, stepping inside. Ryan sighed, rubbing a hand over his face. "Mia, what's really going on?" she interrupted, sitting on the edge of his bed. "I saw your face when you came inside. And Rex, he's not just being protective. He's reacting to something." Ryan considered his options. Mia was 16 now, not the little girl who used to beg him for piggyback rides. She was smart, stubborn, and if he shut her out, she would just dig deeper on her own. He sighed. "Look at this," he said, spreading the papers back out. Mia leaned over, eyes scanning the text, her brow furrowed. "This is about military dogs?" "More than that," Ryan said, tapping the phrase cognitive enhancement trials. "This looks like some kind of experiment. And Dad, he was involved." Mia's face paled. "But Why would he hide this? Why bury it? Ryan shook his head. That's what I'm trying to figure out. He hesitated before adding, and someone else is looking for it too. Mia's eyes widened. The person outside? He nodded. She swallowed hard but didn't look away. What do we do? Before Ryan could answer, his phone buzzed. Chris Evans. Ryan didn't hesitate. Hey, he answered, keeping his voice low. Chris's tone was sharp. You need to come see me. Now. What's wrong? Ryan asked, already standing. I ran the phrase Project Sentinel through my contacts. Ryan, it's bad, real bad. And if you have those documents, you're not safe. The line crackled for a second before Chris added, and neither is your family. Ryan felt his stomach drop. His grip tightened on the phone. I'll be there in 20 minutes. Hanging up, he turned to Mia. Stay here. Keep an eye on Mom, and don't tell her anything yet. Mia's jaw clenched, but she nodded. Be careful. Ryan grabbed his keys, his duffel bag, and whistled for Rex. The dog was at his side in an instant, ears alert. Let's go, boy. As they slipped out into the night, Ryan couldn't shake the feeling that they were stepping into something far bigger than he had ever imagined. And whatever Project Sentinel really was, it wasn't just a secret, it was a threat. The drive to Chris's house was quiet except for the rhythmic hum of the tires against the asphalt and the occasional rustle of movement from Rex in the passenger seat. Ryan's grip on the wheel was tight, his knuckles pale against the leather as his mind ran through every possibility, every worst-case scenario that could be waiting for him. The documents, his father's cryptic note, the figure lurking near their house, none of it was coincidence. He had spent years in war zones, deciphering threats before they unfolded, and every instinct in his body screamed that he was stepping into something dangerous. Rex shifted beside him, his amber eyes scanning the darkness beyond the windshield, muscles tense beneath his thick coat. The dog was smart, smarter than any canine Ryan had ever worked with in the military. It wasn't just training, it was something more. The reports had suggested as much: neurological conditioning, cognitive enhancement trials. The words echoed in Ryan's head like a warning. His father had known something important enough to bury in the backyard rather than destroy. And now, someone wanted it back. Chris's house sat on the outskirts of town, a modest single-story tucked behind thick oak trees. The windows were dark, save for the faint glow of a single lamp in the living room. Ryan pulled into the driveway, cutting the engine, but leaving the keys in the ignition just in case. He gave a low whistle, and Rex perked up, his ears twitching at the signal to stay alert. As they stepped out, Ryan scanned the street. No cars, no movement. The neighborhood was asleep, unaware of the storm brewing beneath its quiet surface. Chris opened the door before Ryan could knock, his expression grim. The former intelligence officer had always been the kind of man who looked like he knew more than he let on. But tonight, the lines around his mouth were deeper, his posture rigid with tension. Without a word, he gestured for Ryan to follow him inside, locking the door behind them. The living room was cluttered with files and open laptops, screens casting an eerie glow on Chris's face as he rubbed the back of his neck. You weren't followed? He asked. Ryan shook his head. Not that I could tell, but someone was watching the house earlier. Chris exhaled sharply. Yeah, that's what I was afraid of. He turned the laptop toward Ryan, tapping the screen. I made some calls. Project Sentinel isn't just some abandoned experiment. It was shut down officially, but the program never really ended. It just went dark, off the books. Ryan's stomach tightened. How bad? Chris leaned forward, his voice lowering. Bad. The project started as an advanced K9 program. Genetic modifications, cognitive enhancements, neural implants. The goal was to create dogs that could process battlefield situations in real time, act independently without human command, anticipate threats before they happen. But there were complications. Ryan frowned. Complications? Chris's eyes flicked toward Rex, then back to Ryan. Some of the test subjects started displaying intelligence beyond what was expected. Not just advanced training, but real measurable cognition, problem-solving, memory recall, emotional comprehension. They weren't just trained dogs, Ryan. They were something else entirely. Ryan glanced at Rex, who sat quietly by his side, his gaze locked onto Chris with unsettling focus. The dog wasn't just listening, he was understanding. Ryan had always known Rex was different, but now the pieces were falling into place. And my father, Chris hesitated. Your dad found out the truth, that the program wasn't just about military use. Some of these dogs were being tested for other purposes, covert surveillance, asset elimination, even psychological warfare. He wanted to expose it, but before he could, he died. He paused, then added carefully, his death was ruled an accident, but after what I've found, I don't think it was. The words settled like a weight in Ryan's chest. His father had been killed for trying to do the right thing, and now they were after Rex. Chris continued, pulling up another file. Here's the part that's going to make you sick. Project Sentinel wasn't just testing dogs. They were looking into breeding lines. Rex, he's not just a participant, he's a product of it. The reason he's special, the reason your dad took him in, is because he was one of the last successful prototypes before the program was supposedly shut down. Ryan felt his hands clench into fists. So they want him back. Chris nodded. Or they want him gone. Silence filled the room. Rex let out a low breath, shifting his weight but keeping his posture steady. He was listening, processing, just like a soldier would. Ryan ran a hand over his face, his mind working through the implications. How do we stop them? Chris leaned back. You can't just expose them. These guys don't play by the rules. If they know you have those files, they'll come after you. Your family and Rex. We need leverage. He paused. There's a name I found buried in some old reports. General David Hayes. He was involved in the early days of Project Sentinel and was close to your dad. If anyone knows the full scope of what's happening, it's him. Ryan's jaw tightened. Where is he? Chris exhaled. Washington, D.C. But if we go to him, we have to be careful. If he's still tied to this, we could be walking into a trap. Ryan didn't hesitate. Then we don't go in blind. We go in armed. Chris smirked, though it didn't reach his eyes. Now you're talking. A sudden noise from outside made them both freeze. A car engine, slow, idling, then shutting off. Chris moved to the window, peering through the blinds. Shit, he muttered. Black SUV, tinted windows. We have company. Ryan's pulse spiked. How many? Can't tell, but they're not here for a friendly chat. Ryan crouched, gripping Rex's collar lightly, steadying him. The dog was already keyed in, his muscles taut, ears flicking at every movement outside. Chris moved quickly, grabbing a handgun from the side table and tossing another to Ryan. Back door? Ryan asked. Chris shook his head. They'll have it covered. We have to move now. Ryan's mind was already calculating. Rex, stay close, he murmured. The dog pressed against his leg, his eyes locked on the door. A knock, firm, measured. Sergeant Carter, a voice called from outside. We'd like to have a word. Ryan exchanged a glance with Chris. This was it, no turning back. Chris's grip tightened on his gun. Hope you're ready for a fight. Ryan exhaled, his mind shifting into combat mode. Always. Then the door burst open. The door exploded inward, splinters flying as the force of the impact sent it crashing against the wall. Ryan moved instinctively, pushing back against the shadows that lunged into the room. The first man through was met with a brutal strike. Ryan's elbow connected with his jaw, sending him stumbling backward. A second attacker rushed in, raising his weapon, but before he could fire, Rex launched forward, his powerful jaws clamping down on the man's wrist. A scream tore through the air as the gun clattered to the ground. Chris was already moving, his firearm raised, 2 shots slicing through the chaos. The first hit the leg of the intruder Rex had taken down. The second found its mark in the shoulder of another man trying to push through the doorway. The SUV outside roared to life, tires screeching as backup prepared to move in. Ryan didn't wait. He grabbed Rex's collar, giving a sharp command, out. The dog released his grip instantly, his training kicking in. Chris was already heading toward the back, but just as they moved, a voice crackled over a radio on one of the downed men. Move in! Take the target alive! Ryan exchanged a glance with Chris. Target. They weren't after him. They were after Rex. They had seconds before more men flooded the house. Ryan's military instincts took over. Assess, act, escape. He scooped up the fallen attacker's gun and grabbed a flash drive Chris had been working with. Garage, he ordered. Chris nodded, understanding immediately. They sprinted through the house, Rex at their heels, his breath heavy but controlled. The garage door was closed, but the side entrance was clear. Ryan reached for the handle just as the first bullets tore through the walls. Glass shattered behind them. Chris cursed under his breath as he fired back, forcing the men to take cover. Go! Ryan barked, pushing through. Rex bolted ahead, slipping through the narrow gap as Ryan yanked open the driver's side door of Chris's truck. The engine roared to life, and before he could even think, Chris had already leaped into the passenger seat, slamming the door shut as more bullets slammed into the side panels. Ryan didn't hesitate. He floored the gas pedal, the truck skidding as it tore out of the driveway. The SUV behind them reacted instantly, headlights flashing as it peeled out in pursuit. Rex was in the back seat, his eyes locked on the rearview mirror, his body low but ready. They were expecting us, Chris growled, loading another magazine into his gun. No way they tracked us that fast. Ryan swerved onto the main road, gripping the wheel tightly. Then we have a mole. The thought made his stomach twist. If someone in the military was feeding them information, then nowhere was safe. His mother, his sister. They needed to disappear. Fast. The SUV behind them gained speed, closing the gap. Another set of headlights flared in the distance. Ryan's jaw clenched. More incoming. Chris twisted in his seat. We lose them now, or we don't lose them at all. Ryan knew what he had to do. He yanked the truck off the paved road, tires screaming as they hit the uneven terrain of an old fire break trail leading into the woods. The SUV behind them followed, struggling on the rough ground but relentless in pursuit. Ryan dodged trees and loose rocks, the truck bouncing violently as they barreled deeper into the dense darkness. Chris was already rolling down his window. Keep it steady, he muttered before leaning out and taking aim. Two shots rang out. One shattered the SUV's windshield, the other blew out a front tire. The vehicle skidded, swerving wildly before crashing sideways into the trees with a deafening crunch. Ryan didn't slow down. That's one down. Chris pulled back inside, shaking his head. Two more to go. As if on cue, the second set of headlights cut through the trees behind them. A black sedan, sleek and built for speed, was closing in fast. Ryan cursed under his breath, glancing at the fuel gauge, running low. They wouldn't outrun this one. He made a decision. We stop running. Chris gave him a sharp look. You sure? Ryan yanked the wheel hard, sending the truck fishtailing before slamming the brakes. Dust and dirt kicked up around them as they skidded to a stop. The sedan hesitated for half a second before its doors flew open. Two men stepped out, weapons drawn. Ryan didn't wait. He shoved open his door and fired. One bullet hit the ground near their feet, forcing them back. Chris moved in sync, firing a clean shot that took one of them in the knee. The second man ducked behind the sedan, returning fire. Then the unexpected happened. Rex leaped from the truck, sprinting low through the dust, his form a blur in the darkness. The man barely had time to react before the dog was on him. A strangled cry rang out, cut short as Rex's weight slammed him into the ground. Silence followed. Only the sound of the wind through the trees, the shallow gasps of the injured man, and the soft rustle of leaves as Rex trotted back to Ryan's side, blood staining his muzzle. Chris exhaled. Remind me never to piss off your dog. Ryan knelt, running a hand through Rex's fur, grounding them both. The dog's breathing was steady, his gaze sharp but expectant, waiting for the next command. Ryan looked at Chris. We need to move. Chris nodded, stepping over the fallen man. And we need answers. Ryan turned toward the wrecked sedan. One of the men was still conscious, gripping his injured leg, his face twisted in pain. Ryan didn't waste time. He grabbed the man by the collar, hauling him upright. Who sent you? The man spat blood, his expression defiant. You already know. Ryan tightened his grip. Say it. A slow, twisted smile crept onto the man's face. Project Sentinel doesn't forget its assets. Rage surged through Ryan, but he forced himself to stay calm. The enemy wasn't just a rogue military faction, it was a machine. one that had been working in the shadows long before he even knew it existed. Chris grabbed the man's radio, tuning the frequency. Static crackled, then a voice. "Status?" Ryan took the radio, pressing the button. "Compromised," he said, keeping his voice cold. A pause, then the voice replied, amused. "You're just getting started, Sergeant Carter." Ryan crushed the radio under his boot. Chris exhaled sharply. "They know who you are." Ryan looked down at Rex, at the dog who had saved his life more times than he could count. "No," he said, his voice firm. "They know who he is." And that changed everything. The wind howled through the trees, carrying the scent of blood, dust, and something darker. Something that settled deep in Ryan's chest like the weight of war. He stood over the wreckage of the sedan, breathing heavily, his grip still tight on his weapon. Rex sat beside him, ears pricked, golden eyes locked onto the man crumpled at their feet. The radio was nothing but crushed plastic and static now, but the words still rang clear in Ryan's head. Project Sentinel doesn't forget its assets. This wasn't over. It had never been over. It had just begun. Chris exhaled sharply, running a hand through his sweat-dampened hair as he crouched beside the wounded man. "You want to live?" he asked, voice low, calm in that deadly way that only men who had seen too much could master. The man groaned, coughing up blood, his defiance cracking under the weight of pain and failure. "Doesn't matter," he rasped. "They'll find you. They always do." Ryan exchanged a look with Chris. The bastards weren't just persistent, they were organized. And if they had tracked them this far, then time was no longer an ally. Ryan knelt beside the man, gripping his collar and hauling him up just enough to force eye contact. "Who's in charge now?" he demanded. The man let out a weak, bitter laugh, the kind that belonged to someone who already knew he was dead. "You think they'll stop? You think you can run?" He coughed again, this time more violently, his body weakening. "You're not just fighting a project," he wheezed. "You're fighting a belief. You think Sentinel was about creating better dogs? Number It was about control. Rex isn't just an experiment. He's proof that they can turn instinct into obedience, thought into orders." His blood-stained lips curled into something that almost looked like admiration as he turned his gaze to the dog. "And he's the best of them." Ryan felt his fingers twitch, his mind flashing back to the documents, the buried files, the notes his father had left behind. He's the key. Ryan had known Rex was different, smarter, sharper, faster than any military dog he had ever seen. But this wasn't about intelligence. This was about ownership. Whoever controlled Rex controlled the future of Project Sentinel. And that meant there was only one way to end this. Chris stood, shaking his head. "He's not gonna talk," he muttered. Ryan let the man drop back onto the dirt, his breathing shallow, his consciousness fading. It didn't matter. They had everything they needed. It was time to finish this. They moved fast. Ryan grabbed the drive from his pocket and handed it to Chris. "Get this out," he said. "Send it to every contact you trust. The military, the press, hell, even conspiracy forums if you have to. We put the truth in too many places for them to erase it." Chris nodded, slipping the drive into his jacket. "And you?" Ryan's jaw clenched. "I go to Hayes." Chris hesitated. "If he's dirty?" Ryan cut him off. "Then I make sure Project Sentinel dies with him." Chris exhaled, nodding once before turning toward his truck. "You sure about this?" he asked, hand on the door. Ryan looked down at Rex. The dog was still watching the fallen man, his body tense, his breathing steady. If they didn't stop this, Rex would never be free. None of them would. Ryan met Chris's gaze. "Yeah," he said, "I'm sure." The drive to Washington, D.C. was a blur of dark roads and adrenaline. Rex lay stretched out in the passenger seat, silent but alert, his presence grounding Ryan in the storm of thoughts roaring through his mind. He replayed every moment, every clue that had led to this. His father's secrets, the buried files, the break-ins, the chase. It had all led to General David Hayes, and Ryan was done asking for answers. He was taking them. He pulled up to Hayes's estate just before dawn, the sky bleeding into shades of gray and gold. The property was guarded, but Ryan had expected that. He parked a block away, slipping out with Rex at his side. Moving low through the shadows, he spotted the weak points, the gaps in security, the places where routine had bred complacency. They slipped through the fence, darting across the lawn. A single guard stood at the back entrance. Ryan took him down in 3 seconds flat, a swift strike to the throat, a silent collapse into the bushes. The house was quiet, too quiet. Ryan moved through the halls like a ghost, Rex at his heels, the dog's senses guiding him toward the faint murmur of voices. He stopped outside an office, pressing himself against the wall, listening. Hayes was inside, and he wasn't alone. "This is out of control," a voice hissed. "Carter has the files. The press will be all over this within hours." Hayes's voice was calm. "It won't matter." Silence. Then, "What do you mean?" Hayes exhaled, the sound slow and deliberate. "Carter thinks he's won, that releasing the files will bring this all crashing down. But Project Sentinel isn't a project, it's a necessity. And the people who truly understand that, they don't play by the rules of politics or public opinion." A pause, then a soft chuckle. "If anything, Carter's just made himself their next target." Ryan had heard enough. He moved. The door burst open, and before the men inside could react, Ryan had his gun trained on Hayes's chest. "Game's over, General," he growled. The other man in the room, a younger officer, reached for his weapon, but Rex was faster. With a snarl, he launched forward, knocking the man to the ground, teeth bared inches from his throat. The man froze, his breath hitching in terror. Hayes, to his credit, didn't flinch. He simply sighed, shaking his head. "You should have stayed gone, Carter." Ryan stepped closer. "You killed my father." Hayes leaned back in his chair, regarding Ryan with something almost like pity. "No, Sergeant, you did." He tilted his head. "Do you really think he didn't know what would happen? He could have burned those files.